House to be again in committee on the Scotland Bill, Lord Dunlop.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now again resolve itself into committee upon the bill.
The question is that the House do now again resolve itself into a committee upon the bill. As many as are of that opinion should say content. Yes. Contrary, not content, the contents have it. Amendment 21, Lord Foulkes will come now.
My Lords, if I can plagiarise Monty Python, and now for something completely different. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to come up with some new ideas, and I'm going to try not to be repetitive. Many people here will recall that in 1999, the late, great Donald Dewar, when at the opening of the Scottish Parliament read from the then Act, said, the first words of the Act were, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament." He went on to say, "I like that." And we all felt much the same. But even then, with only one chamber in the Scottish Parliament, questions arose about whether or not there would be sufficient checks and balances. And the people who raised these questions were being reassured by many people, including from my own party and my own side, not to be worried about it. First of all, because the electoral system they had devised would ensure that no party would have an overall majority. Well, we know what happened to that. Secondly, we were told that the committees would have a new role, that they would be the checks, they would control the overweening, the overpowerful executive. Well, that hasn't been the case, as many people here will know. In fact, the irony is that in this Parliament of Westminster, the committees in both houses have been far more powerful in terms of control of the executive, and challenging them, questioning the executive, whatever government is in power, than they have been at Holyrood. They also agreed at the time that the electoral system would be reviewed after 2 elections if it didn't appear to be working in the right way. Well, that review hasn't happened. So now, after the last election, we have effectively, in Scotland, a one-party state. That is a controversial comment which had been made by a number of people and challenged by the SNP, because, of course, there are other parties in the Scottish Parliament. But they have an overall majority which they use powerfully, coherently and effectively. They have decided to choose one of their own number as the presiding officer. They could have chosen someone from another party. There's never been a Labour presiding officer, for example, in the Scottish Parliament. When we, first of all, were the majority, not the majority, the largest party in 1999, we allowed in fact, encouraged and moved our noble friend Lord Steele to become presiding officer in the Scottish Parliament, much to the chagrin of my good friend Lord Maxton. And the majority on committees is exercised powerfully. I don't know that there's one committee report that has been critical of the Scottish Government. The Justice Committee has got fairly near to that, but still far away. And also, increasingly, civil society, I better not mention the Law Society of Scotland on this occasion, but civil society has become increasingly in the thrall of the one party in control at Holyrood, using alternately the carrot and the stick. And what has happened as a result of that? There have been a number of mistakes, and there have been a number of ways in which the Scottish Parliament has legislated which have caused tremendous problems that I would argue, if there'd been either pre-legislative scrutiny or a second thought, second look at by a new chamber, a second chamber, wouldn't have happened. Police reform is one, a lot in education in terms of the current Universities Act. It's creating huge problems already. But I think I've just mentioned two specifically, since we've got so many lawyers, as we saw from the last few debates in this House. One was their attempt to abandon corroboration in Scots law. My noble friend Lord McCluskey played a large part in raising concerns about this issue. And that was a misguided attempt, which I would argue, if there had been either pre-legislative scrutiny or checks by a second chamber, would not have happened. And the other one I want to mention is this Act, supposed to deal with sectarianism in Scottish football. And as a number of members here will know, I'm a great enthusiast for a particular football team, the Heart of Midlothian Football Club. But there has been unfortunate sectarianism in Scotland over a period of time, and they brought in the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. And it has been criticised not just by Celtic and Rangers, but by a number of people. In fact, I read in today's Daily Record that even Phil Boswell, SNP MP, is under a little bit of criticism for other things at the moment, but he said his own the party's law on this was a major blunder. And I would argue that that major blunder would not have happened again if we'd had the second chamber that I'm proposing. And we've got the second chamber here, and as we see, we've asked the other chamber, the House of Commons, and the government, majority in the House of Commons, and thereby the government, to think again on a number of things. Onshore wind, we've asked them to think again. The grants, when they arbitrarily cut the grants a year early. Vote for 16 and 17, the current one that we're looking at. We asked them to think again, and today they were doing that, thinking again in relation to that. Tax credit cuts, most notably. We asked them to think again, and thankfully, the Chancellor did think again and decided to abandon these proposals. He wouldn't have done that if we hadn't, in the House of Lords, taken this measure and challenged this measure. So, my Lords, this brings me to my proposal. Some people have suggested, including some of my own friends, that this is yet another of the ad hoc changes to our Constitution, and I agree with that. I'm only doing it because that's the way we're doing it at the moment. I repeat what I've said on so many occasions in this House, that I'm in favour of a UK Constitutional Convention to look at things in a comprehensive way. But we're not at that position now. Government haven't accepted. Everyone else has accepted it. Every other party, lots of civil society have accepted it, but the government have not yet been persuaded to accept it. So we have to look at it bit by bit. And that brings me to my proposal. I'm suggesting a Senate of modest size, 46 members. I've given the number of members that would be elected in each of the 8 regions of Scotland, based on the population, based on the electorate, the current electorate, and that brings us to 46. But the Boundary Commission, I'm grateful to the Public Bill Office for help in drafting this amendment, and one of their suggestions was that the Boundary Commission should be included to give power to look at the regions and the number of members from each region, and I think that's right. I suggest they would be elected by a different system from the present Scottish Parliament, and I suggest single transferable vote. That's not to get the support of the Liberal Democrats. They've got the support of Baroness Sutty. Apologies for not being able to be here today, but because I think it's the right thing to do in this particular case. Not in every case, but in this particular case.
The two can be the same.
Yes, and that would be also the election would take place, I suggest, at the same time as the Scottish Parliament, because one of the other criticisms that I've had about my proposal is the cost of it, and the cost would be reduced if the election was carried out at the same time. Now, there have been suggestions from my noble friend Lord Rexton and others that it might be better to have it in between elections to the Scottish Parliament, but that's something that I certainly would be willing to look at. The Senate that I propose would be able to carry out pre-legislative scrutiny. It would be able to review legislation. It would have debates, as we do, on topics of particular interest. And it would have committees with the power to call ministers to give evidence to it. So, as I say, the one criticism that I've had is that of cost. That's why, as I say, the size is relatively modest. I don't necessarily think that these members need to be full-time, although that's something, again, that can be looked at. And I think we can find an existing building in which they could meet. I've suggested a wonderful place for them to meet would be the old Royal High School, which was converted for our use as a Scottish Parliament if we had voted for it in 1979. And many many members here who were members of the other place will have been at meetings of the Scottish Grand Committee there, and it worked extremely well. And it looks like a Parliament, it looks like a Senate. My noble friend, who again apologised for having to leave early, he did expect the debate to have been a bit earlier, but he reckoned without some of the fights that took place opposite, have suggested that there's a suitable building in Glasgow that might be used for this purpose, and certainly that's something that could be looked at. In coming forward with this proposal, I've looked at other countries. Yes, indeed.
He mentioned cost twice, but he hasn't told us how much it would cost.
No. Well, I know the noble member knows the price of everything but the value of nothing, and the value of this is that it would be a democracy, an extension of democracy, and it would be a very small amount, a very small price to pay for an extension in democracy. I've been looking at other countries. In Ireland, all the main political parties 2 years ago proposed to get rid of their Senate. The members of the Dáil wanted complete control, and they had a referendum.
Does the noble lord not know the cost?
This is the moving of an amendment in the committee stage. We've got the report stage and later matters coming up, and by that time, if the noble member is still here and able to ask the question, I'm sure he'll get an answer. The cost depends on a whole variety of things, and at this stage, he can shake his head and put his finger up. We all know what a cynic he is. The new minister has found out what a damn nuisance he is as well. And the government, and he's a thorn in the flesh of the government, but I'm certainly not going to let him be a thorn in my flesh. He'll get it in good time, as I said earlier. He wants to know the price of everything, but he knows the value of very little indeed. I've been looking at other countries. I looked at Ireland, and in that referendum in Ireland 2 years ago, all the main parties wanted rid of the Senate. It was put to the people. Incidentally, all the opinion polls in the run-up to the referendum said that it was going to be abolished. The opinion polls in Ireland are no more accurate than they are in the United Kingdom or in Scotland. And the fact the people of Ireland decided to keep their Senate. They wanted to have a control over powerful executive, the government in Ireland, and I was very pleased to see that. And I was talking with the noble Lord Alderdice just on yesterday, and he was telling me that in Northern Ireland from 1921 to 1975 there was a Senate which operated very effectively at Stormont, and I think that's something that can be looked at as well. The other interesting thing is that in terms of, and I conclude on this, I'm trying not to take up too much time, there's been a lot of time taken up earlier. I've looked at other areas of devolved legislatures. Every state in the United States it has got 2 chambers. In Australia, all of them except Queensland have got 2 chambers. And I think if it's good enough for New South Wales, if it's good enough for Massachusetts to have this kind of democracy and to be able to pay for it, then it's good enough for Scotland. This will be a great extension of democracy in Scotland. It'll make sure that the kind of decisions I've mentioned, which have caused real problems because they haven't been thought through, are unlikely to happen again. And I hope that it will be given sympathetic consideration by by members on all sides of this House today.
Proposed, insert the following. Amendment proposed, insert the following new clause in the words printed in the Marshall list.
Lords, I rise just to make a few brief comments on a very thought-provoking summary from Lord Foulkes of Cumnock. Really, I mentioned the issue of scrutiny in my speech in the second reading. It is something of quite a concern to me all round. I mentioned in that reading that what concerned me was the very heavy constituency load that members of the existing Parliament have, which meant they simply didn't have time to perform proper scrutiny of the legislation of which there's an awful lot in the Scottish Parliament. And I'd further develop the argument to say if we're lumping a whole lot more powers into the new Scottish thing, that problem is going to be exacerbated, and therefore the quality of legislation, and I speak as a resident of Scotland, inevitably will go down. But I would make a further point, which is actually the skill set that is required for scrutiny. I have had the great benefit of watching the noble Lord Hope of Craighead prepare for today, just by chance being in and out of his office a few times. And the care and the precision with which he has prepared for today, and the great scholarship that he has, reflected, I should say, by the noble Lord North as well, is something that doesn't necessarily exist in the constituency MPs that are there in the current Holyrood Parliament. But it is something which is very necessary for the proper scrutiny of legislation such as what we're doing today. There is also an old adage about absolute power. It does disappoint me that the Scottish Parliament has an absolute power today and is actually in many ways a more powerful Parliament and executive than this Parliament, where at least the mirror can be held up and the Lords can say no, and has several times already, which makes the government reconsider things, which does drive change for the better. I just wanted to briefly address cost and maybe answer the question posed by the noble Lord suffering from supper, Lord Forsyth of Drumhead. And that is that if it cost £200,000 per member, it'd be 9.2 million. If it cost £400,000 per member to put them into the field, depending on what sort of parliament you had, it would obviously be double that, just under £20 million. I think the cost is likely to be somewhere in that area. But actually that cost, I think, would be small when compared to the loss of things like foreign direct investment and to the economic damage that is inflicted by badly drafted and thought through legislation. I do, however, have one concern, and that is that I'm not sure that this bill is the proper place for this set of thoughts, but it is certainly a very valid set of thoughts, and I thank Lord Foulkes for raising them.
I'm really fascinated by the marvellous remarks of the noble Lord Foulkes. I was very interested that he mentioned one of my great passions, which of course has occupied a good bit of the Scottish Parliament, about sectarianism at the football. And indeed it was a leading sheriff in Dundee who actually pointed out that the legislation, he regarded it as what he called mince. I hope that's not an abusive term. But it came down to the fact of lip reading as to whether one supporter was singing the correct words or not of the sash my father wore, or other terms which might be abusive. But quite apart, leaving that aside, I commend the noble Lord Foulkes for his thought in trying to get a revising chamber for the Scottish Parliament. Now, the noble Lord Foulkes actually was kind enough and good enough to refer to the superb, to my mind, second reading speech of the noble and learned Lord McCluskey. What I think the noble Lord Foulkes was quite tactful, not to mention, were some of the comments made by the noble and learned Lord. He made a reference to sheep, and that was one of the more moderate aspects. But certainly I did appreciate it very much what the noble and learned Lord had to say. But one of the points that the noble and learned Lord made in that proposal, which I think is relevant to what is in the amendment before us, is the standard of pre-legislative scrutiny and actual scrutiny by the committees, by existing members of the Scottish Parliament. Now, if the noble Lord Foulkes believes that there is a field of, 92 persons in Scotland who can provide a higher standard of scrutiny, quite apart from the cost and the time involved, I salute him for his optimism, but I just wonder if, with all the guidance that many of these so-called amateurs might need, that he will be able to find. On the other hand, my lords, I look around your lordship's house this evening, and I find my noble friend, the noble Lord Dundee, I'm tempted when it comes to cost of thinking the chant of Up with the Wallets of Bonnie Dundee, perhaps he might be paying, or some of us might be sought to be rich enough to pay ourselves, I'm not too sure. But if your lordships would care to glance at the marvellous second reading speech and comments of the noble and learned Lord McCluskey, I think that if I were a member of the Scottish Parliament, I would repeat the wise words of the Vietnamese gentleman, do duck low and stay well out of the criticisms that have been quite justifiably directed, I think, in that particular area. But I commend the noble Lord Foulkes for his imagination and thoughts. But on the other hand, I do dread to think what the costs might be.
First of all, can I just say that with Monty Python, I remember it always finished with the words, it came up with the end, and then it said, and now for something completely different. You just throw my late father-in-law into an absolute power, because he couldn't stand Monty Python. We all insist on watching it. And it came up with the end, and then he'd think it was the end. He'd go with a great big sigh of relief, and he'd say, oh, and then they go, and now for something completely different. They'd ended exactly the same thing, by the way, as they'd been doing the rest of the programme. So I rise just to make 2 points on this. 3 points. First of all, I do support it. I didn't support a second chamber in the first place when we set up the Scottish Parliament because I did feel the powers we were giving it did not warrant a second chamber. This, now we're giving extra powers, does warrant having a second chamber as a balancing to the first chamber. That leads me to the second point I want to make, which is that I do not believe, as my noble friend said, that the elections ought to be on the same day, because there is a grave danger with that of the political makeup of the Senate being exactly the same as the Scottish Parliament. And that, of course, raises problems because what will they do? How will they check it? How will they be a counterbalance to the main chamber if, in fact, they are of the same political complexion? Yes, it would be more expensive, maybe, to have the elections in between, but you could have them on the day when other elections were taking place. And, of course, if you had my way and it was all done with an ID card and electronically, the costs would be eventually considerably less than they are at present. My last point and third point is this, that if you elect people to a position, I'm very sorry, but they insist on having more power than my noble friend is prepared to give the Senate. That's what happened in the United States. Believe it or not, the original Senate in the United States was appointed, and it had little power. It had the same sort of powers as we have here. But once they moved to elections, once they moved to an elected system, then, of course, the Senate increasingly became more and more powerful and in the end was actually more powerful than the House of Representatives. That is the danger, I fear, with the Senate that my noble friend is proposing, is that eventually you'll have elections and they will insist on taking more power than the major body which is elected by a different system. I have no objections. I'm a first-past-the-post man, first and foremost, and therefore I would obviously like the Senate to be elected that way too, and indeed the Scottish Parliament. We wouldn't be in the fix we are now if we'd had first-past-the-post in 2007, certainly.
Just on that point about the Scottish Parliament, if there were to be a Senate, does my noble friend envisage that we would still have to retain the same numbers in the Scottish Parliament?
That is a very good point. I will look forward to my noble friend Baroness Adams putting down an amendment to my noble friend's amendment when the time comes for report, because that is a very interesting question. That why should you have the same numbers in the Scottish Parliament if you have a Senate as well? So those are the 3 points I wanted to make, and on that I do give my support to what my noble friend is proposing, but I do think that we have to look very carefully at it, and I hope to be able to move amendments at report stage to it.
I have to say, I am astonished that the noble Lord Foulkes should put forward this amendment at this stage in the bill. He spent the last 2 years arguing against piecemeal constitutional reform. He sat uncharacteristically silent throughout the proceedings, no doubt because he believes in what this bill is trying to do, which is to allow the Scottish Parliament to determine their own rules and their own provisions, including composition and the rest. And here he is wanting to impose an entirely new body upon them as a second chamber, ignoring the difficulties which this House has had with the other place in resolving the issue of what if you have 2 elected houses you do to avoid gridlock and to avoid a squabble over powers. And quite frankly, if one was going to create a second chamber for the Scottish Parliament, which I would have thought was entirely a matter for the Scottish Parliament, then it would need to be done in a way which addressed these problems. And on the basis of the performance of this House, I should think it will take at least 100 years and still not be resolved. So I just find it extraordinary, with so much to do in this bill, that we should be discussing an issue of this kind. Also, if the answer to a problem is more politicians, then you have certainly asked the wrong question, particularly in the current climate. In Scotland, we are overrun with politicians. We have 129 in the Scottish Parliament. We also have 59 MPs. Our constituents have no idea who is responsible for what or who their representatives are. Add to that some people called senators, and I think the noble lord will complete the task in a second. The noble lord will complete the task, which is pretty well achieved, of having the electorate treating members of Parliament with a certain degree of contempt and as a laughingstock. I give way to the noble lord.
I do have to ask the noble lord whether or not he actually believed in being a politician democratically elected by his constituents, because that is, at the end of the day, what a politician is a democratically elected representative of the people. And I wouldn't say more is always better, but it doesn't follow that more is necessarily bad.
I think, well, actually, to deal with the point about the politician, after I left, I was asked to leave the House of Commons by the electorate in 1997, I went to work for Fleming's as a banker and was very proud to call myself a banker. And then when the financial crisis came along, things got so bad, I started calling myself a politician again. And then we had the expenses scandal, so I decided to call myself a company director. I mean, really, if the noble lord doesn't realise that there is a problem not just in Scotland and not just in Britain, but in France and in America and elsewhere, and you can see that in some of the eccentric choices that are being made now by the electorate, that problem comes from a complete contempt for the political class. And at this time of all times, when money is short, and by the way, when this bill goes through, we haven't seen the fiscal framework, but money will be very, very short indeed in the Scottish Parliament when they substitute a Barnett grant for a tax base. And the notion that they could find money to have an extra 40-plus politicians, plus all the attendant special advisers and machinery and the rest, is utterly ridiculous. So I hope we won't spend very much time discussing this particular amendment, which I think is a complete distraction and totally wrong. However, having said that, the noble lord is perfectly correct in saying that there is a problem with the governance of the Scottish Parliament. Could I just gently point out who it was that was responsible for this? And when the noble lord cited all these examples of failures of policy, and I could add considerably more, where was the Labour Party? Where was the opposition in the Scottish Parliament standing up to all of this? So I don't think the fault lay in a second chamber. I think the fault lay in the opposition to the SNP, and indeed in the case of my own party, who gave them the ability to be in government by supporting them in government. Some criticism could be made. But this is not an argument for a second chamber. It is an argument for having vigorous members of the Scottish Parliament, who I hope will be elected in May, doing the job which they are required to do. And in terms of the proposals, in terms of numbers, I mean, there is already great confusion, we'll come on to this later in the bill, about the boundaries of constituencies and responsibilities. I mean, I was very struck, I think it was ITN who did a poll, where they discovered that some huge number, I think it was 90% of the Scottish electorate, had absolutely no idea what powers were going to be conveyed by the Scotland Bill on the Scottish Parliament. And a similarly high percentage, well over 50%, concluded that when asked were of the opinion that whatever they were, they didn't go far enough. So I do think that there is a job to do for the Scottish Parliament in engaging with the electorate and a job with the opposition. It is true that they are failing in a wide range of policy matters, but I don't think a House of Lairds, a bunch of people calling themselves senators, is going to resolve this problem. But fortunately, it is not a problem for this House. It is a problem for the Scottish Parliament.
My Lords, if I may be brief, I made points in the second reading speech, which the noble Lord, Lord Lisle, has referred to. We're all agreed about one thing, that there is a problem. Whether the House of Lords, the unelected House of Lords, is the right place to start giving a lead in that matter is something entirely different. I wouldn't fashion the problem in precisely the words that the noble Lord, Lord Foulkes, has mentioned, the one-party state. I think I have previously used the expression that was made well known by Lord Hailsham, an elective dictatorship, because that is in substance what you've got in the Scottish Parliament at the moment. The Scottish National Party, for its own reasons, whips its MPs so effectively that there is no dissent. And for reasons that I mentioned in my second reading speech, the weakness of the opposition is palpable. There are some good people, and by the way, there are one or two good committees as well, but the committees of which I've experienced, largely to do with justice, are not satisfactory. So I agree with Lord Maxton that there's a problem about having an elected House. The great thing about the House of Lords is it's not elected, and therefore we're not answerable to constituents. And because very few of us are left with ambition, having reached an age and a state in our careers when ambition is no longer available to us, we can say what we think. However, that is not a popular idea in the country generally. I'm not sure that I'm totally committed to the idea of an elected second chamber, but there must be some system. One forgets that many of the institutions which are extremely powerful in shaping our political debate and the political results are not elected at all in this country. I mention only, for example, the press. The press is said to be free and independent. Well, it may be free, it is independent of government, but in no sense is it elected by anyone. I get no say in who appoints the editor of the Times or the editor of the Sun newspaper, or for that matter of the Daily Mail. And they have considerably more influence on what happens in this country than this House does, but they are not elected either. So what I do feel, and maybe this is just a start, I think there is a duty upon those of us who share the idea that there's a real problem, a duty perhaps to publicise that problem in Scotland and to try to persuade the Scottish electorate and the people generally that the problem has to be tackled, but perhaps not in this way, although I certainly support the idea that something must be done, an expression which I hesitate to use because of its antecedents.
My Lords, it was fairly dispiriting to come back into the chamber with seeing part of our archaic language, which it's taken me a while to adjust to, being a member of this House, compared to the Scottish Parliament. Seeing the enunciators at ending of the House adjourned during pleasure, and then to be for pleasure to end, and then the Scotland Bill to be brought back to us. And when that first happened, when I joined this House, I asked the Clerk of the Parliament what that was, and he did ask me the question. He said, didn't you have any pleasure in the Scottish Parliament? And I said, no, not very much at all. But it is a pleasure to hear the noble Lord, Lord Foulkes, although his persuasive skills are renowned, but I'm afraid I am not persuaded by the case. When I was a constituency member of the Scottish Parliament, I absolutely considered that it was my both duty and role to be as an effective constituency member as anyone else. But I was also aware of the pressures on constituency and regional members of the Scottish Parliament. At one time, I was a member of 3 parliamentary committees, 2 legislative, and one was the Finance Committee, being scrutiny and legislative. And it most certainly was the case that there was a strain on the number of members. I think it is worth reflecting that it wasn't designed to be such. When the Parliament was established and when the consultative steering group were looking at the fundamental principles of how the Scottish Parliament should operate, it was very much designed to be a very different type of institution for here. There was going to be much stronger pre-legislative scrutiny. That element has been successful. This Parliament has learnt from the approach for pre-legislative scrutiny, with draft bills now becoming a norm. The committees in the Scottish Parliament, because of its nature, are both legislative and scrutiny. The committees were designed to be the strength of the Parliament. In the previous element, the noble Lord Forsyth said the Scottish Parliament only sits 1.5 days. It was a frustrating misconception when I was a member of that Parliament that some of the press who were operating, who had, I felt, an agenda against the Parliament, that view was reinforced by those who said it only sat for 1.5 days. Yes, the plenaries were there, but unlike this place, the committees in the Scottish Parliament has precedence. So they met on Tuesday mornings, Tuesday afternoons and Wednesday mornings because of their distinct role. Conveners of committees, the feeling was that they were going to be equal to ministers. The parliamentary strength was going to be balancing the executive authority. And there was to be a shadow civic parliament. There were going to be much stronger civic input into the way that the parliament operates. It was disappointing, and this is where there's a mea culpa from my party, which was part of administration early on, but it's most certainly been accelerated since 2007, is that the Scottish Parliament has become remarkably like the Westminster Parliament. It's an absolutely dominant executive. The committees have become gradually weaker. They don't even have conveners elected by the whole Parliament, which was an innovation by the House of Commons. The procedures of the Parliament have become weak in comparison with the power over the executive when it comes to money. And if there's anything that the Scottish Parliament can learn from our experience now, is that the parliaments that reduce the ability to hold government to account for the money they spend on the Parliament on behalf of the people weakens Parliament. Ultimately, that has meant that there have been some examples where there has been less scrutiny than I, as a former member of the Parliament, would have liked, whether it's on police reform, where my party was the only party to vote against what's happened because there was a large majority and the executive was able to take it through, criminal justice reform, other areas of two areas that are now currently being challenged by Brussels on the Scottish Futures Trust and the delivery of infrastructure, minimum unit pricing, which has been challenged to the quality. Now, fundamentally, these are my observations, and these are my observations as a former member who loves that institution, who wishes it well, and was a very proud member of it. But it is not this place to tell that institution, and I agree with the noble Lord Forsyth, it is not this place. If this place has a role, which I know that there are members of one of the major party in Scotland that will never accept it, and I understand the reasons for it, if this place has a role for the former members of the institutions, that sometimes we can, with deep respect, say to that institution that it is worth them considering their own procedures. I live in the area where I used to represent as a member of the Scottish Parliament, so I still maintain a vested interest in that Parliament working well. But I think that there is a case for some form of much heightened, strengthened pre-legislative scrutiny. There was a very good lecture given by Sir David Edwards, who's I don't think I need to rehearse his qualifications for this, where he argued for a Council of State, which was using the existing organisations, the Ombudsman, the existing organisations that we currently have set up within Scotland, to be a much stronger check on the proposals being put forward. I think corroboration would have been one of the areas where, actually, if there was stronger pre-legislative scrutiny for that. But equally, I do believe that there is increasingly going to be an argument for some form of check before the final stages of Scottish Parliament legislation. Ultimately, it could well be, if there's a reformed House of Lords, that we have a mandate from the Scottish people directly or indirectly through the Scottish Parliament for senators in this place, that we may well have some joint capacity, both with the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament. And this is where I will not need to address the next amendment on the working relationships, because this is my point. But ultimately, and members may not be, or noble lords may not be entirely surprised that I will say this, ultimately that should be one of the areas where we consider in a constitutional convention to look at the proper functioning, a continuing strengthening of the Scottish Parliament, how it operates, the areas where this institution should rightly have a relationship with that, and ultimately that we seek the better, stronger Scottish Parliament able to do its job. So therefore I'm not persuaded of the solution that the noble Lord has brought forward, but I do think, and with the deepest of respect to the institution that I love, then I hope that it takes very seriously, especially in the context of the successful passage of this bill, where the Scottish Parliament's powers over budget, over taxation, will be greatly enhanced.
I don't want to take up any more time on this issue, but I would remind the noble and learned Lord Dunlop that when I followed the noble Lord, the Earl of Kinneil, at second reading, I asked him a question, and the question was, having regard to what we see in the bill, whether he felt that the Scottish Parliament was able to cope with the additional powers which we're passing to it. Of course, it's a matter for that Parliament to work its own procedures, and I absolutely understand that, but we do have an interest, since we're devolving these additional powers, and it would be very unfortunate if the Parliament, as presently constructed and designed for a totally different situation, was so overloaded it couldn't really fulfil its function.
Lords, for the similar reasons, I'll keep my comments brief, not least since I see that the target is to reach Amendment 42 this evening. I think, my Lords, there's general agreement that the noble Lord Foulkes has done a service because he's actually identified a problem, and it's how we really address that problem, and there are two facets to it. One is actually how to ensure there is a review of the present chamber, but there's also been the problem identified that as its responsibilities grow, how is it going to cope with the demands made on it? Now, as everybody, I think, has agreed, Lord Foulkes has identified the problem, but not necessarily come up with the most appropriate answer. And I very much share the view of the noble Lord Max, and that's my view as well. On the one hand, an elected chamber. On the other hand, you're just giving it the power to review, to propose, to pass resolutions, but no power to say no to the other chamber. That's a recipe for instability, because elected members will start saying they're as illegitimate as the members of the other place. We demand more powers. So it's how then we look at the problem, and that's clearly been the conundrum, because people said, well, yes, there is a problem, but we're not quite sure what the answer is. Now, I do recommend that we should look at legislatures elsewhere. The Noble Lord Foulkes said, well, there are quite a lot of bicameral legislatures. Indeed, they are. They're in a minority. Most legislatures are actually unicameral. So we could look at them, see how they go about addressing what we've identified today. I mean, one possibility, there's one legislature that actually is one body, it's elected, but then splits itself into two chambers. So there are different things we can look at. I think there is a problem. I accept the point about this is not the bill to start engaging in what is significant piecemeal change, but it does give us the opportunity to stand back and actually start to think through consequences, which we're very bad at doing, and recognising what those problems are and actually standing back and thinking about them. But I accept that the ideal would be to stand back and look at all the problems in the round, how they relate to one another, and stop doing on this rather piecemeal basis.
My Lords, I'd like to thank my noble friend Lord Foulkes of Cumnock for bringing this forward. I can't help but make the point that it's a pity that we're dealing with this in this time of night. Also, that people are, noble lords are curtailing their contributions in this, which I think, in this period, which I think is one of the most significant periods of the evening, because, quite frankly, we've been treated to 2 or 3 hours of negativity with continual attacks on the bill, continual attacks on the noble lords and ministers bringing forward the bill, and it's refreshing to have an extremely positive contribution from the noble Lord Foulkes to address a problem, because there is a problem. I know the one-party state is, I think that's overstating it, but as we miss the experience of having Scottish Nationalist Party members in here contributing to this debate, I think it's mirrored in some ways with the Scottish Parliament, where the committee system was supposed to balance up, but now, as I understand it, it's all the one party that controls the committee chairs and controls the members of the committee, and they're not operating as a check and balance on government, on the executive, and I think that's something to be regretted. The noble Lord, my noble friend Lord Foulkes, I don't think is any expectation, any great expectation, you never know, any great expectation of this bill, of this amendment being incorporated in. But what I think he's trying to do, and what he has done, is spark a debate about a real issue that we need to address, and the people of Scotland and the Scottish Nationalist Party and other Scottish parties, political parties, have to look at as well. I take the point from Lord Forsyth. This is probably not the bill to do it in, but nevertheless, by moving this amendment, he has raised the issue, highlighted it, got some really thoughtful contributions from people which had elements of negativity, but nevertheless addressed the problem, addressed the amendment. I won't mention anybody in particular being negative all night, but he knows who he is. I think the noble Lord has done us all a service. He's brought this forward. The details are in the amendment, and there's noble lords here will understand the amount of work put in by Lord Foulkes in assembling this amendment. It's a first-class amendment. We are not opposed to it. We congratulate the noble Lord for bringing this forward, and hope that it sparks a debate, as it has, not just in here, but hopefully with our Scottish National Party colleagues in Scotland, that they can turn their mind, and that's where I think the real bonus will come from my noble friend's contribution here, because if he and we can spark a debate in Scotland, including with our colleagues in the Scottish National Party, to look at this situation, I think he'll have done a commendable service. So I therefore appeal to our colleagues in Scotland to give this particular attention. And I don't think, in closing, I don't think we can. I think we can be proud of the example we set. Most of us here, but not all, are determined not to destroy the place by what we would call irresponsible behaviour. But most of us here are committed to the positive side of this House and the revising job that it does. I would like to see something like that in Scotland, take our Scottish National Party colleagues along with us, and I think the people of Scotland would be better served by that. But I close by again thanking my noble friend for his extremely thoughtful contribution.
As the noble Lord Foulkes might appreciate, I am increasingly conscious that the robust scrutiny of this chamber could be seen as an elegant example of how a second chamber can operate. Be that as it may, the proposal that he puts forward by way of his amendment is not a reflection of what was contained in the Smith Commission agreement. The establishment of a second chamber did not feature. However, as noble lords will be aware, Lord Smith, in his personal recommendations, observed that the transfer of these substantial new powers would mean that the Scottish Parliament's oversight of the Scottish Government would need to be strengthened. And I recognise the noble lord's desire to see that the exercise of these substantial new powers should be properly and effectively scrutinised. This Government fully endorses Lord Smith's recommendation that the Scottish Parliament's oversight of the Scottish Government needs to be strengthened. But as Lord Smith set out, it is in the first instance the responsibility of the presiding officer and the Scottish Parliament to take forward this important work. I thank the noble Lord Foulkes for his contribution to this debate and for raising before us what is, and was noted by the noble Lord McAvoy, to be a real issue. Nevertheless, I would say on behalf of the Government that this is not the place for such an amendment. This is not a place to bring in such a proposal when it was not addressed in the Smith Commission agreement, and I would invite the noble Lord to withdraw this amendment.
My Lord, can I start with an apology? An apology to the Minister, Lord Keane, noble Lord Keane, for my irritation earlier on. As Lord Kirkhill pointed out to me, the noble Lord hasn't been a minister here, hasn't been a member here for very long, and we should give him more toleration. And that is something that perhaps some on his own side ought to reflect on as well. So I hope he'll accept my sincere apologies. Can I say, however, I think he's wrong. Just because it wasn't in Smith doesn't mean to say it can't be in the bill. The bill says to amend the Scotland Act 1998 and make provision about the functions of the Scottish ministers and for connected purposes. It doesn't say to implement the Smith Commission. So it is entirely within order. Indeed, the Public Bill Office wouldn't have allowed me to get away with it if it hadn't been. Can I say how much I welcome the widespread, fairly widespread, support that has been given? I think everyone, as Lord Norton said, recognises there is a problem. I thought perhaps Lord McCluskey chose a better description for it, quoting from Lord Hailsham, of an elected dictatorship than the effective one-party state that I described it. I think that is the case. And there are different ways of dealing with it. I've put forward one proposal and one suggestion of a way that it might be dealt with. And it's been suggested by some, astonishingly, from certain quarters, that this isn't our responsibility. And yet the same people are trying to impose all sorts of things on the Scottish Parliament, notwithstanding that. And I think that Lord Norton, in fact, is right with this. Of course, the presiding officer has a principal responsibility for looking at this along with her colleagues. But there's nothing to stop us, as we found earlier, making recommendations and indeed legislating. I think the only two people who've been members of the Scottish Parliament who've spoken are the noble Lord Purvis and myself, and we both have respect. I don't think Lord Stephen spoke in this debate, but he spoke in previous debates, and of course Lord keeps changing his name, and I never remember what James's latest title is. Lord Selkirk of Douglas, thank you, was also a member. I do have the same respect that the noble Lord Purvis has, and I understand why he may not be as convinced as I am of the need for change. I served on the audit committee, and we did some good work on the audit committee with Hugh Henry in the chair, but that was at a time where the SNP didn't have an overall majority. And I don't know if he fully realises and appreciates the change that has taken place since the SNP have had a total overall majority. Like PMQs, but even worse, at FMQs, the First Minister has the last word. And look at the size now of the executive. What Willie Ross and 3 junior ministers used to do is now being done by 13 cabinet ministers, each paid over 100 grand, and 11 other ministers. I mean, it is really quite astonishing the way in which that has grown. And I accept I don't accept it from others, but I accept from Lord Purvis that this matter would be best dealt with in an overall way through a constitutional convention. And Lord Purvis and I have been active in that. And to be fair to, and it's difficult on this occasion, but to be fair to Lord Forsyth, he does also support the idea of a constitutional convention. What he's so far been unable to do is to persuade his government that it's the right thing to do. And I think to some extent it would be useful if he spent some energy trying to persuade his government to accept the wisdom of that. Can I say I really do welcome the support from the Earl of, from Lord Kinnoul. I think the point he made about constituency members having this load and being very busy with dealing with caseloads is a really important one, and it added to the case that I made. I'm also grateful to the support of Lord Lisle, who, like me, is a football fan, and I mean, he knows that it's astonishing that some people can be put in prison for 5 years, up to 5 years, for one of these offences, and yet it is now being criticised by some of their own side in the Scottish National Party, but nothing seems to be able to be done about it. I'm grateful to the qualified support from my noble friend Lord Maxton, and like Lord Norton, of course there is the danger that an elected House will want to accrue power, and that is something that we have to take account of as well. So there is a problem. I think that everyone recognises that. I don't think that it's something that to which there is an easy solution, and that's why any solution that is brought forward by anyone is open to criticism of one kind or another. But I do think it's about time that we talked about these things, that we addressed them. I think it's even more important that it's addressed in Scotland by the Scottish civil society, as well as by the Scottish Parliament. After all, the Scottish Parliament itself says it's the people of Scotland that are ultimately have the sovereignty. And as one of those people, and I speak not just as a member of this House, but as one of those people, and I've been getting quite a lot of support, I notice, on Twitter. It's not often I get support on Twitter, as some people here will know, for this proposal, and quite a lot of support from other quarters. It is about time that we started looking at it in a sensible, coherent and systematic way, and if I've contributed just a little to that, then I'll feel it's been worthwhile to move this amendment. But nevertheless, I withdraw it.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? It is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 22, the Earl of Dundee.